Have you ever noticed how certain individuals appear to have an almost silent control over their surroundings without ever raising their voice? They don't argue, they don't plead, they simply pull back. And suddenly everything shifts. The atmosphere changes. People begin to wonder, to pursue, to feel uneasy. Now imagine if you acted the same way. If you stopped reacting instantly to everything, if you chose quiet instead of automatic replies, distance instead of emotional explosion, what would actually happen? That is where the real idea begins. When you are no longer constantly available emotionally, physically, and mentally, the environment around you often reacts strongly, because many people are used to influencing you through your reactions, your impulses, your predictability. But the moment you step back, the dynamic changes. And those who believed they fully understood you suddenly realize they understand very little. Carl Jung once suggested that everything that irritates us in others can lead us toward deeper self-awareness. Now reflect on that. When you become less reachable, who becomes uncomfortable? Who starts reacting emotionally? Who tries to provoke you just to pull a response out of you? This often reveals more about them than about you. And it can also reveal how easily you may have been influenced without noticing it. Many people keep giving themselves away just to maintain peace, to avoid conflict, or to hold on to people who were never truly present in the first place. And with every forced agreement, every immediate reply, every emotional overreaction, a part of your internal energy gets drained. By the end of it, what remains is exhaustion, irritation, and a quiet emptiness that is hard to explain. The reason is simple. Too much of your attention is being given to those who don't value even your silence. This is not about rejecting the world. It is about choosing yourself. It connects to what Jung referred to as individuation, the process of becoming a complete, authentic version of yourself. And this process starts when you realize that silence can carry more strength than endless arguments. That stepping back, when done consciously rather than out of fear, becomes a form of inner authority. So the question arises, how long will you continue reacting to the emotions of others as if you have no choice in the matter? From an early stage in life, many are trained to be overly responsive, to answer quickly, to agree, to please, even when discomfort is present. Over time, this builds a belief that your worth is connected to how accessible you are. But that belief is misleading. Excessive availability is not a strength. It becomes a subtle form of limitation. When you believe you must always be reachable, emotionally or otherwise, you become easier to influence, easier to exhaust, and easier to overlook once your usefulness fades. This happens because predictable people are often treated as resources rather than individuals. People begin using you as an emotional outlet, reaching out when they need comfort, validation, or attention, then disappearing when they no longer require it. And this creates an illusion that being constantly present will eventually bring the same presence back toward you. But life rarely works in that direction. Jung spoke about the persona, the mask people develop to gain acceptance and approval. Often, this mask is what keeps individuals overly accessible. You might say you are fine when you are not. You might respond instantly even when drained. You might justify yourself unnecessarily, as though you owe constant explanations. But in reality, the more you position yourself as constantly available to others, the more you drift away from yourself. Overextending your presence becomes a quiet form of self-neglect. It turns into a pattern of seeking approval while slowly abandoning your own boundaries. And every time this happens, your internal balance shifts. Your energy is not endless, it is limited and must be protected. People who expect constant access to you are not always interested in you as a person, but rather in what you provide: attention, emotional relief, distraction, or validation. When you begin to change and introduce boundaries, or when you stop reacting instantly, the response from others can be resistance, irritation, or even accusations. They may label you as distant or different, not because you have become someone else, but because you are no longer fulfilling a role in their emotional system. And here lies an uncomfortable truth. Excessive availability often reduces perceived value. What is always accessible is rarely respected in the same way as what must be earned. At this point, an important reflection emerges. Who truly deserves your attention, your presence, your energy? And equally important, who does not? But before reaching that conclusion, it is necessary to understand why reacting so quickly has become such a habit. Why do people feel compelled to respond instantly, to defend themselves, to explain everything, to avoid discomfort at any cost? The answer is deeply connected to what Jung described as psychic energy. And understanding this changes the way you relate to your inner world. Jung did not view the mind as something random or chaotic. He saw it more like a system of energy, where every thought, emotion, and reaction consumes a portion of your inner resources. The real question is whether you are directing that energy consciously or allowing everything and everyone around you to consume it for you. Each impulsive reaction carries a cost. Every unnecessary argument, every defensive response, every attempt to please someone who does not appreciate you slowly drains that internal reserve. He also emphasized that what you resist tends to persist. The more you react without awareness, the more you remain tied to situations that weaken you. People who constantly feel drained are not necessarily weak. They are often misdirecting their attention and energy. And when a person becomes emotionally exhausted, they become more exposed. In that state, manipulation, emotional dependency, and opportunistic behavior from others become easier to fall into. Jung suggested that a balanced psyche is one that knows how to preserve its energy internally. That means learning to say no without guilt, remaining silent without feeling powerless, and observing situations before reacting to them. True strength lies not in constant reaction, but in the ability to choose response consciously. This requires awareness of your own triggers, those emotional buttons that cause immediate reaction without reflection. Think about how many times a single conversation has disturbed your peace for hours or even days. How often have you replayed words in your mind, analyzing what you should have said, or trying to understand someone's behavior repeatedly? That is energy being lost without return. You are keeping old emotional situations alive long after they should have ended, feeding cycles that exist only because of continued attention. Psychic energy works like an internal field. When it is protected, it creates presence. You enter spaces with clarity and quiet confidence without needing to prove anything. But when it is scattered, you become reactive, drained, and easily influenced. And environments rarely show mercy to those who give away their energy without awareness. This is why observing your triggers becomes essential. What situations make you react instantly? What kinds of words or behaviors disturb your balance? These are points where your energy leaks. And recognizing them is not about becoming cold or detached, but about becoming selective and aware of where you invest yourself. One of Jung's deeper insights suggests that when you conserve your energy, you begin to break the unconscious projections others place on you. Many people interact not with who you truly are, but with what they project onto you. And when you stop reacting in expected ways, those projections lose their power. This is where manipulation often begins to fail, because the predictable emotional response is no longer available. Most people believe they are consciously choosing their emotional reactions, but in reality, many responses are automatic, shaped by conditioning and repetition. Those who understand these patterns can easily influence predictable behavior. They do not need force or confrontation. They simply activate familiar emotional triggers and wait for a reaction. Jung referred to projection as the process where internal experiences are placed onto others. But what is often overlooked is that emotionally accessible individuals become constant targets for these projections. The more available you are, the more you become a surface for others to place their expectations, frustrations, and emotional needs. Some people will only approach you when they need something resolved, when they need comfort, or when they want validation. They may even praise you, but only as long as you serve a function in their emotional world. And as this continues, you may find yourself repeatedly placed in roles you did not consciously choose. You become the listener, the problem solver, the emotional anchor, or the always available presence. The moment you step outside these roles, the dynamic shifts, and discomfort arises in those who depended on your availability. None of this happens by coincidence. They are not truly relating to you. They are relating to the version of you they imagine, the role you have unconsciously agreed to perform. And why do you agree to it? Because there is fear underneath it all. Fear of disappointing others, fear of not being loved, fear of being left behind or abandoned. The most effective form of control does not come through shouting or force. It operates quietly, through guilt, through the invisible pressure of feeling like you owe something. When you believe you must always be available, always helping, always understanding, even when it drains you internally, that is where control silently takes root. And this is the core of it. A manipulative dynamic does not require someone to dominate you directly. It only requires that you keep responding in the same predictable way. But the moment you stop reacting, the structure collapses. When you begin to say no, when you respond with silence instead of explanation, when you withdraw instead of over-justifying yourself, the projection starts to break. The image others built of you begins to fall apart. And that creates discomfort, because suddenly they are no longer dealing with the version of you they controlled in their mind. This is where confusion starts for them, because they no longer know how to place you. And even more unsettling for them, they are forced to face themselves. Not everyone is prepared for that confrontation. Your emotional unavailability becomes threatening because it reflects back their own inner emptiness. The silence you hold begins to expose the noise they were avoiding within themselves. And when that happens, resistance appears. Criticism, emotional outbursts, drama. Not because you are wrong, but because you stopped functioning as their emotional mirror. Carl Jung once expressed that we do not reach understanding or growth by chasing light alone, but by bringing awareness to the shadow within. When you withdraw and stop feeding certain cycles, the hidden aspects of others begin to surface. Their shadow reacts. And for people who have relied on you as an emotional outlet, this becomes extremely uncomfortable. But then the question turns toward you. Are you prepared for the discomfort of being misunderstood, of being judged, of possibly being rejected, simply because you chose to protect your energy? Are you ready for the silence that follows separation? Because within that silence, a different form of strength begins to form. The modern world is constantly loud. Everyone wants to speak, respond, defend, and prove themselves right, even if it costs them their inner peace. But there exists a deeper form of power that very few truly understand: the power of silence. Not silence as avoidance or weakness, but silence as conscious control. A deliberate withdrawal from unnecessary reaction. A silence that is not emptiness, but intensified awareness. Jung viewed silence not as a void, but as a space where transformation becomes possible. When you stop reacting immediately, observation begins. And when observation deepens, patterns become visible. You start noticing emotional cycles, repetitive behaviors, subtle manipulation patterns, and self-destructive habits that were previously hidden under constant reaction. Silence creates clarity, and clarity becomes uncomfortable for anyone who benefits from your confusion. Have you noticed how certain people become uneasy when you don't respond right away? When you don't explain yourself, when you simply remain distant or unavailable? It is not because they miss you in the pure sense. It is because your silence removes their ability to control the narrative. As long as you respond, you are still participating in the game. But when you withdraw, the structure changes. And that shift destabilizes those who depend on your reaction. Real silence is not the absence of expression. It is mastery over internal energy. It is the decision not to engage in emotional battles that drain your attention unnecessarily. It is the ability to step back from situations that do not deserve your presence. Jung described individuation as a process that requires separation from external noise, so that inner truth can be heard clearly. Only in that quiet space does self-awareness begin to form without distortion. But silence always comes with a cost. It creates distance from people who only valued your reactions. It confuses those who only understood you through their own assumptions. It may even make you appear cold, detached, or distant. But much of that reaction comes from people who were never interested in your depth, only your availability and utility. The deeper truth is that as you mature, your speech becomes more intentional. You begin to realize that your words carry weight, and not every situation deserves access to your thoughts. Sometimes, silence is not withdrawal. It is authority. It is the expression of someone who no longer feels the need to constantly explain their existence. Silence makes others uncomfortable because it forces them to confront their own thoughts. It removes distraction, and in that space, their internal state becomes visible to them. That discomfort often reveals more about them than anything you could say. You are not required to justify your absence. In fact, your absence often explains itself more clearly than any explanation could. And those who feel disturbed by your silence are often the ones who benefited from your emotional imbalance. But the most profound silence is not the one that affects others. It is the silence that rebuilds you internally. The silence that disconnects you from external validation and reconnects you with your own center. In that internal space, free from external demands, your energy begins to return. You start to reclaim parts of yourself that were previously scattered across different people and situations. This is where boundaries begin to form naturally, not as punishment toward others, but as protection of self. It becomes clear that understanding these ideas intellectually is not enough if behavior does not change. If you continue saying yes when you mean no, if you keep engaging in draining conversations, if you remain in dynamics that exhaust you, then awareness becomes meaningless. Real change begins only when action aligns with understanding. Conscious withdrawal is not about becoming emotionally cold or indifferent. It is about becoming selective. It is about no longer granting unlimited access to your attention, your time, and your emotional presence. It begins with small decisions, not replying immediately, pausing before reacting, stepping away from unnecessary arguments, turning off availability without guilt, and choosing when to engage instead of reacting automatically. The most important realization is this: you do not owe constant explanations for your boundaries. You do not need to justify your silence. Every explanation you give often becomes an opening for others to pull you back into old emotional roles. When you stop explaining yourself, you remove that access point. Jung understood that individuation often includes a phase of isolation. Not a depressive or painful isolation, but a necessary one. A sacred withdrawal where identity is rebuilt without external interference. In that space, you begin to hear your own voice more clearly than the collective noise around you. A simple indicator of your progress is observing who becomes uncomfortable when you change. Who distances themselves when you become less reactive? Who tries to provoke you when you no longer respond as expected? And who claims you have changed the moment you begin protecting your peace? These reactions are not signs of error. They are indicators of liberation. At first, being less available feels uncomfortable. Guilt may arise. You may question your actions or feel like you are being selfish. But this discomfort is part of restructuring old conditioning. You were trained for years to prioritize others over yourself, so naturally change will feel unfamiliar. Conscious unavailability becomes the foundation of self-direction. Every time you say no to external demands, you are saying yes to your own stability. Every time you step away from draining environments, you reaffirm your inner value. And every time you stop explaining yourself, you begin to experience a different kind of respect, even if it comes from fewer people. Not everyone can handle this version of you, because your absence disrupts their emotional expectations. It reveals how much they depended on your reactions to maintain their own internal balance. And when that structure breaks, discomfort follows. This is the moment of rupture. And within that rupture comes confusion, loneliness, and the feeling of loss. But in reality, nothing essential is being taken away. What is happening is release. You are detaching from patterns that kept you limited. After this phase, something begins to shift. First, there is silence. Unsettling at first, almost heavy. You begin questioning whether you made the right choice. But over time, that silence transforms. It becomes calming, cleansing, and stabilizing. Then solitude appears, not as emptiness, but as presence. A deep awareness of yourself without interference. This is the solitude of strength, where you no longer betray your own boundaries to maintain connection with others. Gradually, confusion turns into clarity. Anxiety begins to fade. Emotional dependency weakens, and a more grounded sense of self begins to emerge. This is where real inner strength develops, not from external validation, but from internal alignment. Carl Jung suggested that becoming oneself requires stepping away from collective expectations. It requires shedding roles, breaking identification with the mask, and spending time in separation so that authenticity can form without distortion. And within that process, something fundamental changes. You stop existing as a reaction to others and start existing as yourself. And that is exactly what is happening when you choose to step into unavailability. You are not escaping life or running away from the world. You are actually coming back to yourself. At this stage, you are no longer just reacting to everything around you. You start becoming the one who creates direction. You are no longer shaped only by external events. Instead, you begin shaping your experience from an inner foundation. The people who become uneasy with your absence often reveal something important. They were never truly connected to you as a whole person. They were attached to the version of you that served a function in their lives. And now that you no longer fit into that familiar role, they feel confused, uncertain, even disturbed about how to relate to you. In a way, this realization becomes freeing, because it shows you what was real and what was simply attachment to usefulness. Yes, you may lose certain people along the way, but in that space of loss, you gain something far more important. You begin to rediscover yourself. You may distance yourself from familiar places, routines, and relationships, but in return, you reconnect with your own essence. You may become misunderstood for a time, but that misunderstanding slowly transforms into a deeper form of respect, because you are no longer bending yourself to be understood by everyone. When you stop making yourself available for everything and everyone, something shifts fundamentally within you. You begin to carry a different kind of value, one that is not based on constant access or predictability, but on presence, depth, and self-respect. You start becoming less common in the emotional sense, more rare in how you engage, and that rarity changes how you are perceived. Do not mistake this for ego or superiority. This is more like a rebirth, a new beginning, the start of a phase where you are no longer accessible for emotional leftovers, for confusing dynamics, or for connections that drain more than they give. At this point, you begin to accept only what aligns with your peace, what respects your truth, and what supports your wholeness, rather than fragmenting it. And if you have reached this point of understanding, it suggests that something inside you is already shifting. A part of you has already recognized that being accepted or loved means very little if, in order to receive it, you have to abandon yourself in the process. Real self-respect begins when you choose yourself without needing validation for that choice. Even if that choice leads you into temporary solitude, it is still a form of alignment rather than loss. Now ask yourself honestly, are you prepared to be misunderstood, rejected, or even judged for the sake of your inner clarity and peace? Are you willing to accept the discomfort that comes with standing in your truth without constantly explaining it? Are you willing to experience the consequences of no longer playing roles that others were comfortable with? If this message resonates with you, if it feels like something you recognize within yourself, then simply acknowledge it in your own way. This is not about performing or proving anything to anyone. It is about recognizing a shift that is already happening internally. Let it settle naturally, without pressure, without forcing meaning onto it. What matters now is not external approval, but internal alignment. And when you continue on this path, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. You stop negotiating your peace for acceptance. And in that space, a different kind of life begins to form, one that is quieter, clearer, and more rooted in your own presence.